Before commenting on what I am talking about in this video, I suggest watching it the whole way through. And if you relate to any of the things that I'm talking about in this video, I highly recommend doing your own research, because Tulpas or Tulpamancy is a very complicated topic. There is no way that I can mention everything in this video. There are also a lot of sub-communities and a lot of things that relate to Tulpamancy that you will probably also relate to. As you've already probably put together, in this video I'm going to be talking about Tulpas or Tulpamancy. Tulpa is basically a being or an imaginary friend, or for those who are maladaptive daydreamers that are watching, a para. However, a Tulpa is what happens when an imaginary friend becomes basically its own being. It's what happens when an imaginary friend or a para goes beyond the conscious mind. It is what happens when the host mind, the person that is in control of the body, it is what happens when an imaginary friend that they have created starts existing without the host mind willing them to life. A Tulpa does not need the host to be actively thinking about them to exist. A Tulpa exists in the background of the host's mind. Because a Tulpa can exist without the host actively willing them to life, they start to become their own being. They start becoming separate from the host. They start having their own thoughts and opinions, likes and dislikes that can be very different to the host. However, Tulpas are not alters. Alters can only exist in the mind of someone who has either dissociative identity disorder or OSDD. Tulpas are not alters. They can't be alters. Researching Tulpas, I found a lot of communities hating on the idea of Tulpas, especially those who are in the dissociative identity disorder community, because Tulpas are so similar to alters. For anyone who doesn't know anything about dissociative identity disorder, it's a disorder that you form when you are young, meaning below the age of 9. You can't develop dissociative identity disorder after the age of 9. It's impossible. There is a very small community of people who claim to have developed DID after the age of 9, and there is also people who claim to have developed DID without trauma, which again is also impossible. You need to have trauma and it needs to have been formed before the age of 9. The reason I found so much hate on the idea of Tulpas is because there is a very, very small amount of people who are saying that they have DID and claiming that they have DID because they have Tulpas, but Tulpas are not alters. I found a overwhelmingly large amount of people hating on the idea of Tulpas, but in terms of people who are actually claiming to have DID because they had Tulpas, almost non-existent. I'm not saying that there aren't people who are claiming to have DID who have Tulpas. I'm just saying that the ratios are just, basically there aren't very many people who are claiming to be a DID system because they have Tulpas, but there is a very large amount of people who are hating on people who have Tulpas for claiming that they have DID. Let me get one thing clear. Tulpas have nothing to do with dissociative identity disorder. Literally its own thing. Tulpas are not alters. Most people who have Tulpas don't claim to have DID. While yes, I can understand that someone who has a Tulpa may be confused and think, oh my gosh, I have DID. But for the most part, they never really mix. Dissociative identity disorder and Tulpas are completely different. Well, yes, a Tulpa coexists with the body's original consciousness. They aren't alters because there is no amnesia. A Tulpa cannot fully take over a person's body. Well, yes, they can influence the person into doing things. They cannot take over the body where the original consciousness doesn't have any control whatsoever. That doesn't happen. A Tulpa needs the original consciousness to exist in this reality. So they can do things in this reality, but it has to be alongside the original consciousness. An alter does not need the original consciousness or the host to be present to do things. A Tulpa exists in the mind without the original consciousness willing them to life. Now that I have clarified that when I talk about Tulpamancy, I am not talking about DID in any way. I'm not talking about endosystems. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm going to talk about how maladaptive daydreaming and Tulpamancy coexist together. It is very common for someone who is a maladaptive daydreamer to have tulpas. You can have more than one tulpa. In fact, I can almost guarantee that most people who maladaptive daydream have had at least one tulpa in their lifetime. A tulpa is basically what happens when a para becomes its own person, to the point where you don't really have control over what they decide to do. When you are daydreaming about this para or this para-me, you stop having control over what they are doing and the decisions they make. I found that a lot of people in the maladaptive daydreaming community have kind of stressed the fact that they don't have control over everything that their paras and their para-me's do. There comes a point in time when they are so well developed that they literally become their own being. This is essentially a tulpa. Sometimes tulpas can kind of seep outside of their paracosm and kind of come into our reality a bit. So a lot of people who maladaptive daydream have reported that they can kind of hear their para-me's or their paras whispering in their head and influencing the decisions they make, or channeling their paras or para-me's through into this reality so that they can do things. For example, if someone is afraid of speaking in front of a class, they might channel their paras or their para-me into this reality to help them overcome that and to actually help them do the task of speaking in front of a class. This is a tulpa. Yes, having tulpas is a very common thing in the maladaptive daydreaming community. However, there are people who don't maladaptive daydream that do form tulpas. People who don't maladaptive daydream still have the ability to create their own tulpas. However, unlike with maladaptive daydreaming, they actually have to actively do it. People who are maladaptive daydreamers don't actually mean to create tulpas. It just happens because you are so intensely creating this character that they become so developed that they go beyond what we could fuel. There is a point in time where they must become their own thing. So while this does happen naturally in maladaptive daydreamers, where we are making tulpas and not even meaning it, there are people who aren't maladaptive daydreamers that actively go through the process of making a tulpa. For people who don't have a maladaptive daydreaming mind, the process of making a tulpa is lengthy. It requires a lot of commitment and keeping that tulpa alive, because tulpas can die if you aren't actively engaging with them. Then a tulpa will eventually die or stop existing. They need the original consciousness to actively be kind of fueling them to keep them alive. A maladaptive daydreamer does this effortlessly without even thinking about it, but I suppose people who aren't maladaptive daydreamers have to actively keep their tulpas alive, and it's almost like a chore, whereas maladaptive daydreamers, we do this without even thinking about it. It's just our second nature. There are a lot of sub-communities that kind of shame people for creating tulpas, because there are a lot of places that say that the idea of Tulpamancy and creating these beings in your head is a closed practice that can only be performed by monks and stuff like that. This is complicated because, once again, tulpas exist naturally in the mind of a maladaptive daydreamer. It's essentially part of like a mental illness. So in that sense, it can't really be a closed practice because it's part of a mental illness. However, after doing a bit more research, I realized that the original version of a tulpa is very different to the one that exists naturally. The kind of tulpa that they are talking about being in a closed practice is different to the tulpa that I am talking about. It is different to the tulpa that we force into existence, or a maladaptive daydreamer accidentally creates. The original meaning of a tulpa is different to the modern meaning of a tulpa. I don't feel that I am educated on this to kind of talk about this on my channel, this kind of close practice stuff. So if you are interested in learning about it and kind of understanding what not to do, then please do your own research. But don't feel like if you accidentally have this tulpa in your head, you have done this thing that you're not supposed to do, because, well, it's not your fault. This video has been very complicated. So in conclusion, 1, a tulpa is not an alter, and it never ever can be unless you have DID. Unless you already have dissociative identity disorder, a tulpa can never turn into an alter. Therefore, if you have tulpas, you are not an endosystem. 2, tulpas are basically their own being that is separate from the original consciousness. They are what happens when an imaginary friend or a character that exists in the mind of the original consciousness becomes so well developed that they split off and become their own thing that can exist in the background of the original consciousness. 3, having tulpas is not a closed practice, or tulpamancy is not a closed practice, because tulpas exist naturally in those who are maladaptive daydreamers. It is literally part of a mental illness. While yes, the original type of tulpas may be a closed practice, there's not really enough information for me to kind of understand what is the closed practice. When it is 100%, when it is naturally existing in your brain, it is not a closed practice. It can't be. It's part of a mental illness. If you want to do your own research and you're confused on where to start, I have left some links in the description. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end, because that was very complicated, but I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I hope that this new concept of tulpas can kind of bring you some closure on what is happening with you, because I definitely have tulpas, and I also have dissociative identity disorder. So I was very confused at what, they weren't alters, but they weren't paras, they went beyond that. So I definitely was very, oh wow. Shout out to Alexis is Mad, who actually told me about tulpas. So you're a legend. Go subscribe to her. She is also a maladaptive daydreaming YouTuber. Stay safe.